Hey there, so in this lesson we're going to talk about for loops. I'm going to reuse the loops practice class. I removed all the code from the previous lesson. So in the previous lesson, if you recall, we were talking about while loops. The while loop was a control structure that is used to do something over and over and over again while something is true, okay? Inside of those parentheses, whatever statement is in there, if it evaluates to true, the instructions given would execute over and over and over again. So eventually we needed a case to stop that loop, and so we would have a condition to break out of that loop so that whatever was in those parentheses would eventually evaluate to false, and that's how that loop would end, okay? So that's the concept behind a while loop. While something is true, do something over and over and over again. The for loop is sort of a variation to that. You're basically saying do something over and over and over again for something. That's why it's sort of referred to as a for loop. And the idea is that it's a specialized case where we want to step a variable through a series of values, right? So for example, let me show you a loop where we step through a variable. So for int I is equal to 0, and I'll explain to you what all this is in a minute. And inside of this loop, I'm going to print out the value of I. Okay, so when we run this, notice that it prints up to 99, all right? So this is the general structure of a for loop. The first part of it is the initialization. We're initializing a variable and we're assigning it a particular value. All right, in our case, we initialized I is equal to 0, okay? This initialization step only happens once. Right before it's about to start the loop, it initializes the value of I to 0. And then we have the test, okay? This is a Boolean expression. It's basically, it evaluates to either true or false, okay? So until I is less than 100, we want to continue this loop. And then of course we eventually want this loop to end, so we have this final condition, which is the increment, okay? Where in our case we were doing I++, which is of course increasing I by 1. And remember, this incrementing is the same as this. We're basically taking the current value of whatever I is, adding the number 1 to it, and then assigning it back to that variable. And then every iteration it'll just basically increment by 1. You've seen this before. So this is the general syntax for a for loop, all right? Again, recall that the while loop was while something is true, do something over and over and over again. Now, for loop is loop over this, all right? We want to step a variable through a series of values, and that variable here is I, okay? So this kind of structure is actually quite helpful when you're trying to solve problems and you want to iterate over a particular variable based on some value. So in this case, we had 100 as the value, and you might be wondering, okay, well, do I just come up with this number randomly, or how does this number originate? And that depends on the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. So for example, let's say we have a string. I'm going to define a string variable here called name, and I'm going to give this a really long just string, okay? It doesn't matter what's in there. Now this string obviously has a length, right? We can call the .length method on this particular variable, and that will return us the number of characters that are in this string. So let's actually create a loop for iterating over each of these particular characters. So the way we can do this is, instead of the 100, we can just say name.length, and that will give us the number of characters in this particular string. So if we want to, for example, print every single character in this string, I can say this to indicate that we're going to print out a character, and then I want to basically print out the specific character. And if you recall from the previous lesson, to get a particular character from the string, we reference it using the char at, okay? So we can say name.charat, and then we give the particular index value. And I'm just going to say I. All right, so it's going to originate from the 0th index. It's going to print the S, and then it's going to sort of move on to every single character of this string. Now here's a pop quiz. Do you remember what the index position would be of the last character of a particular string? Remember, that was the length of the string minus 1, because when we just say length, we basically count it as a human would, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But again, remember that in a computer, everything starts from 0. And the S here in the string, it has a 0th index, and the F all the way here at the end has the length of the string minus 1 as a position. That's why when we say I is less than the length of the string, it won't give us a problem. So let me run this so that you can see what I'm talking about here. Notice that it prints out every single character of the string all the way up to F. Some people make the mistake of putting a less than or equal to sign here, and that would mean that I iterates all the way up to and including the length of the actual string. And let's run this and notice what happens here. It's saying string index out of range 19. So it turns out that the length of this string is 19, okay? But in a computer, we start from 0. And so the F would actually be in the 18th position, not the 19th. So the reason why this exception occurred is because we actually told I to loop all the way up to and including the number dot length, which was of course 19. So the way to fix this is to either remove the equal sign, all right, or you can leave the equal sign but make sure that it iterates up to a maximum of dot length minus 1. Okay, so that brings this I all the way up to 18 and no more than that. So let's run this and we don't have a problem anymore. All right, it's that time again, and that is for you to try an exercise. So the assignment is for you to alter this loop so that it actually prints starting from the last character going backwards. So when we printed this, let me expand this for you. When we printed this string, we went from character S all the way sequentially down to F in that order. Your job is to print these characters backwards, starting from F all the way down to S. So your last character here will be S. So give this a go and pause the video now. When you're ready, you can unpause it and we'll go over the solution together. Good luck. So the first thing we need to do is we need to, like I said, every for loop has 3 steps. The first part is initialization. And I want to initialize the particular variable. So we're going to be dealing with this variable I. We're going to be looping for I. I'm going to assign I the length of this particular string, name.length minus 1. Okay, so we're initializing I to be the index position of this character right here, the last character F. The next part of the for loop is the test. Okay, we are testing for whether something is true, and only when it's false this loop will eventually end. So we need to put a condition here, an expression that will eventually cause this loop to end, and that will happen when I is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, and I want to decrement instead of I plus plus, what this does again is it increments I by 1. I want to actually decrement I. Okay, since we're starting from all the way, I think it was 18 right here. We're starting I from 18, and every iteration we are decrementing it by 1. Eventually, it will get to 0. And when it does, this loop is going to end. So again, a loop has 3 parts. The first part is the initialization. The second part is the test. And then the third part is some action and whatever we do to that particular variable, whether we increment it or decrement it. That's just a way to eventually smoothly end this loop. Now keep in mind, we can also, instead of having I minus minus here, I can do I is equal to I minus 1. It would do the same thing. Basically, it's an operation that we want run every iteration and decreasing the current value of I. So to save space, I'm just going to move it back to I minus minus. So let's run this and see what happens. And there we go, we solved the problem. So hopefully you got that right, and if you didn't, don't worry, You're going to be seeing more problems along the way, and you'll get plenty of practice. All right, so we're not through yet. There's one more exercise that I want you to work on, and that is to print all of the numbers that are even between 0 and 100, inclusive. 0 is even, as well as, of course, 100. So print out all of the numbers that are even between 0 and 100, inclusive. All right, so I hope you had a chance to try that on your own. I'm just going to remove this old loop, and we'll just create a new one. For, and inside of this for loop, int I is equal to 0. Okay, so the first part, we're initializing our variable that will be passing through this loop on every iteration. That's I. We initialize it to 0, and then we want a condition that will be checked every single iteration, and if it's true, the loop will continue, and finally when it gets to false is when the loop is going to end. And that condition is I is less than 100 and I plus equals 2 is going to be the operation that will be conducted every single iteration. Okay, that's the third part. So by the way, this I plus equals 2 is the same as this. So it's basically going to be the current value of whatever I is, add the number 2 to that, and then assign it back to itself. And this is going to happen every single iteration. And of course, every iteration, the value that's stored in I is going to be changed, and it's just going to continue to add the number 2 to I, and that's how we're going to be able to get all of the even numbers from 0 to 100. Now, I did make a mistake in this loop that I just caught, and I want you to think about what that might be. So let me first actually print out all of the i's. So when I run this, you'll notice that there's a mistake. Remember, the requirement was to print out all of the numbers from 0 to 100 inclusive, and only the even numbers, right? So when I hit run, let's see what happens. It started from 0, great. It went all the way down to 98. So 100 is missing here. So obviously we missed an equal sign here. Okay, I is less than or equal to 100, and once I is 100, this will still be true. This condition will still be true, and it will actually print that out. When I was less than 100, it got to 98, but then I was going to be 100 after, for the next iteration, and it couldn't do that because this equal sign was missing. Okay, so we need this equal sign here so that it gets to the 100th number, and we can print that out. Okay, so now let's hit the play button, and notice it goes all the way down to 100, from 0 to 100. Right, so hopefully you got that right. Now, similar to +2, you can do this. You can do +3 or +5, and it'll basically print every fifth number up to 100. And you can also do -5. That's the same as this. We're basically taking the current value of I, subtracting 5 from it, and then assigning it back. And then every iteration, it will basically reduce by 5. And that will basically take us into the negatives. And this loop will actually, well, take a guess what's going to happen. If I run this, this loop is going to continue to go on forever and ever. And I think int has a ridiculously low number it can go to. And until then, my loop will continue to run like this. Okay, so this is an example of an infinite loop, and these sorts of things can happen all the time if you're not careful.